Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast, the podcast all about the delicate balance between people and business, and quite literally reconnecting the two. My name is Tracy Rubin, and I've spent nearly my entire professional career in HR. Join me as I share stories, opinions, and words of advice with you each week. Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I sincerely hope that you cannot hear the construction in the background. I've literally tried to put off recording this episode for as long as humanly possible in order to not make you hear the construction that I've been hearing basically 24/7. It doesn't usually get like this, but I don't know what's going on. I don't know. But here we are. I hope you can't hear it. If you can, I do apologize. I understand if you skip through the episode as a result. But hopefully you don't, because we are going to talk about some fun and interesting things. I'm answering a few questions that some of you have submitted, and I think that it's important that we talk about something that is actually going on, or has, I guess, hit the airwaves, so to speak, this week that I've at least noticed on LinkedIn especially. First things first, it is a Tuesday. If you're listening when this episode comes out, happy Tuesday. I have some very interesting, crazy personal information to share with you in the coming weeks. I'm not able to share it just yet, but I do want you to know that I am giving you a cliffhanger on purpose, and that is because some of these future episodes are going to be very, very interesting, and we're going to get super candid. If we haven't, we've been candid on this podcast. I've been telling you a whole bunch of truths, I guess we could say, for the last year and a half, and it's not going to change now, but there is some interesting stuff going on in my life. And if you're connected with me on LinkedIn, you'll probably find out there first, but I don't want to jump the gun, so to speak, and get ahead of myself. I want to tell you everything once, everything is set in stone, but some very interesting things coming down the pipeline. Also, don't forget to connect with me on Instagram. That is probably the best way to stay connected with all things podcast related. And it's a great way, I think, to connect with me directly. A lot of you message me throughout the week, and that is where I get so many ideas for content, but also answer or receive some of your questions, which we'll get to toward the end of this episode, so make sure you stay tuned throughout. And finally, at the end of the episode, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast, share it with a friend, family member, and keep listening. Thanks for being here again. Let's get right into the episode. So this week's episode is going to be all about pay transparency. And we're talking about this because it is everywhere, at least in my network. I'm seeing so many people sparking conversations around pay transparency and pay perception, equal pay for equal work, whatever you want to call it. I'm seeing so many people talking about it. And I want to talk about it on today's episode because it's the start of the new year. We're going into annual reviews if your company, has that process, which most do. And I think that this topic, especially considering 10 cities and states across the U.S. have specifically come out with laws and legislation around this. And actually, just to give you some context, California, New York, a couple other states have already, for the last few years, disallowed employers from asking candidates specifically what they earn, which is why if you're in an interview, you're probably being asked, so where would you like to land from a salary perspective? What are you looking for in terms of compensation versus how much do you make today, or how much do you make in your role? How much did you earn? Because those questions in some states are not lawful. And so many companies that operate in a number of states have just said, hey, let's take a blanket approach and not ask any candidate, regardless of where they work. This is against our policies. And that's the approach I've always taken. Regardless of the state, just apply a one-size-fits-all based on the most strict criteria or the most strict state and legislation based on, the states in which you operate. Anyway, New York has recently, and I think this is why it's been on my radar, probably because of where I live and where I work, but New York says that as of April 2022, employers in New York City will be required to list the minimum and maximum salary on all job postings, promotions, or transfer opportunities. And I have to tell you, I wasn't really sure what to think when I first read this and saw that this was going to take place in terms of the law in New York. I have mixed feelings on it, which I want to share. I'm going to break down all of my feelings, mixed and otherwise. But this is the biggest, hottest topic of conversation today for good reason. Obviously, from an equity standpoint, diversity, equity, and inclusion as well, pay transparency is really important. And not even just that, pay equity in terms of, who is making what based on the role they're in, based on the experience they have, based on their tenure, et cetera, performance, whatever you want to bring into play. If person X and person Y have basically the same resume, they should be paid within the same range. Now, I have said before on this podcast that there are so many factors that come into play when someone's pay is different than another person's, and it could be something as simple as the negotiation at the time of offer and the time of hire. If I negotiate my starting salary, but, person Y doesn't, and we have the same resume, I could be starting $5,000 to $10,000 higher than that person. And while it could look on paper as discriminatory or inequitable, it might not actually be. So we want to approach this subject with some objectivity and neutrality, because sometimes pay inequities, so to speak, are not necessarily inequities, but rather a flaw in, this in society, actually, because we know, for example, and I've said this on the podcast before, that men are more likely to ask for, more money or negotiate their offer compared to women. Obviously, there are a number of factors there as well, but let's just take it on the surface for what it is, that is something that has been studied. So the goal, I think, as an employer, and even for me as an HR professional, would be to rule out an opportunity for there to be pay discrepancies or inequity. And one of those things, which is what we're talking about today, is pay transparency. So let's take, for example, a sales associate role. Let's say a sales associate role at Target pays $15 an hour. And the, Target as a business says, okay, for all New York City postings, we want our range to be $15 to $18 per hour. So on their postings beginning April 2022, which is only a few short months away, which is crazy, because by the time this episode comes out, it's already February. So hold on to your bootstraps, everybody. We are flying through time. Anyway, April 2022, Target says, hey, New York City postings, this is the range. So let's say I'm applying for a sales associate job, and this is my first job out of high school, and I have no experience. I may look at that posting and say, oh man, I really want to make $18 an hour. That would be amazing. But the idea of the minimum here is that it's showing you the minimum of what someone can earn, and that minimum typically is associated with having little to no experience, or maybe no experience in that industry or what have you. So for me, as a fresh out of high school person, no experience, sales associate job, I might want $18, but Target could say to me, hey, actually, you don't have the experience to qualify or be eligible for the $18 an hour. We're offering you $15 an hour. That employee can then, or that candidate can then either accept, negotiate, decline, so on and so forth. Another person, a sales associate, candidate, could say, I have 5 years of experience. I want to apply. I believe I need $19 an hour. Well, Target may say, hey, our maximum is 18. You see that on the job posting. I'm sorry, we have no room. That, I can imagine companies are going to really want that maximum salary there in order to be able to predict cost more. Like, I could definitely see that as being a positive to all of this. But I also see this, at least based on the current market, where it is a candidates market. I've been saying this for months. The candidate is in the driver's seat, and the employer is trying to get up to the passenger seat, but is desperately fighting from the back seat to get there. I mean, employers right now have such a poor hand, so I'm sure that, they are going to want to say, hey, we need to make the max big enough to be able to offer the right candidate the right amount. I wonder, though, and I know I'm kind of jumping around here in my thoughts, but this is just the way that I work sometimes. I wonder if the law will allow employers to offer discretionary amounts that are higher than the maximum salary, or if that would be considered a lack of transparency or unlawful. Should be interesting to see. I tend to believe that legislation and these laws that are intended to protect employees or future employees can be very helpful, but I think there's a fine balance, and this is where I want to talk about my mixed feelings in a moment. So we'll bookmark this point in terms of like the reach of the government and how that it can impact employers. So we'll table that for now. But before I go into that, I just want to also mention that candidates, should be very clear that the range can also mean that they will not hit that maximum, and that maximum may be something to think about in terms of like promotional opportunities. So let's say a manager candidate is applying for a role. They currently sit at $80,000 a year, and they see a job that is minimum 70, maximum 100. That manager candidate can then say, well, I sit at 80, I want to move to another role at 90. That 10K maximum in terms of the gap between where I want to be offered and the maximum of the role is what I could potentially expect promotionally or as I earn merit increases. Because I could see this being almost a strategy for candidates, thinking, okay, well, maybe they're going to start off at the higher end or the lower end, but then being able to have clarity on what the role would then go to. Obviously, there are economic factors, though, in terms of inflation and things like that do change the range of roles. But I think it's just an interesting thing for a candidate to kind of put in their back pocket. One question that I guess I have just to kind of put out there that I will definitely take with me as this legislation continues to roll out, and I'm sure other states will follow in suit, is really around employers that operate in various states. So if an employer pays employee X $20 an hour in New York because of the cost of living, but pays employee Y in Ohio $15 an hour because of cost of living, I guess the question is, will companies leverage pay transparency in all of their states? Will companies decide to pay the same rate regardless of where the operating state is and what the cost of living is? Because, companies definitely leverage that from a budgeting perspective, looking at, one state versus another in terms of cost of living and adjusting salaries that way. Whether right or wrong. This is just normal, and I don't think there's anything wrong with adjusting budgets based on cost of living because it's just a strategy. But I do think that companies will need to consider the way it will look if one employee in New York is making, or there's pay transparency for an employee in New York, for example, making $25 an hour versus pay transparency in Texas, where an employee is making $18 an hour. Like, could that inherently create conflict? The short answer is probably yes, but the long answer could be no if there's an understanding of why pay transparency is happening in certain states versus others, and for employees to lend that understanding to the situation rather than jumping to the conclusion that they are not being paid fairly or whatever could come of that. This episode is brought to you by Namely. With workforces continuing to evolve, it's more important than ever to keep in pace with the nature of business. But it can be even harder to stay ahead and keep employees connected and engaged. That is why you need Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that offers everything you need to set you up for success in the new year. So that way you can tackle any curveballs that 2022 throws your way. Namely helps you easily adapt to the ever-changing workplace and maintain a great employee experience, whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees. With onboarding, performance management, and intuitive benefits enrollment, all in one connected and modern platform. Plus, Namely can streamline your payroll, time tracking, and vacation requests so that you can be everyone's favorite HR leader no matter how your company grows. Companies are built on people. Don't let either fail. Stay ahead and learn more about making the switch to Namely. Learn more about making the switch to Namely today at namely.com. Don't wait, that's namely.com. Okay, so here is where my mixed feelings come in. I alluded to this before, and I'll share it now. I feel like governments play a very specific role in protecting employee interests. And if they disrupt that balance in protecting employee interests, it could weigh too heavily or put too much pressure on a business to navigate all of the legal mumbo jumbo, if you will. And I say that very objectively as an HR leader who, quite frankly, gets paid to know the law. Like, I'm not an attorney, but I get paid to understand legal obligations and so on and so forth, especially as new legislation comes up. And so, yeah, sure, I benefit from governments instituting different legislation. But aside from that, taking that benefit aside, because it's not inherent, right? I'm not getting paid by the government to understand what's going on, nor am I getting paid by an employer to specifically know the law, but rather have a working understanding. Employees obviously have a benefit when, reap an inherent benefit. And I am also an employee in an organization, right? So there is that mutual symbiotic relationship, I guess we can say, in having laws that look out for employees. Of course, there's no doubt about that. I do think, though, that when governments do incorporate legislation that puts too much of a burden on an organization, and I'll break down what that means, too much of a burden, that's such a loaded sentence, or loaded phrase, but I'll get to it. I think that it can ultimately work against what the legislation is seeking to achieve. So when I say putting too much of a burden on, I mean providing too much guidance, providing too much legislation, I think can be a little bit detrimental to employee interests, even if on paper it looks like it is in the interests of the employee. For example, pay transparency. We're talking about it now. My mixed feeling is that too much transparency actually makes it harder for the employee to negotiate a higher salary. And as someone who loves to negotiate a higher salary, just candidly speaking, this makes me think, well, gosh, when I'm the candidate in this situation, am I going to hate or love the pay transparency? Now, obviously, if someone has experienced pay inequities because of, a lack of diversity, a lack of equity, a lack of inclusion at an organization, pay transparency is a wonderful thing. I think that, I'm playing devil's advocate to my own thoughts, but I do think, in this context, there's going to have to be either a lot of gray area in the legislation, basically saying, hey, employers, you have to provide pay transparency, maybe to employers over a certain number of employee headcount, so that it makes sense, because I could see how a small business, it doesn't make sense for a small business maybe, but for a medium to large scaled business, this definitely makes more sense because there are more employees that they're hiring. So I caution the government maybe a little bit from providing too much information on how to navigate this, because I think sometimes that's where the beauty of a gray area comes in. If New York says, hey, you have to provide pay transparency on all of your job postings, internal and external, and that's it, then that gives the employer the opportunity to say, hey, they're not saying that we can't go above this range, but let's commit, this is what our budget commits to. Maybe a budget commits to 80 to 100K for a role, but then that gives the employee the opportunity to negotiate higher than 100K. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how will employers be able to, be competitive with an offer. So if someone comes back and says, no, I want to, negotiate 10,000 more than what you're offering, how do employers do that if the law is too strict? So my hope is that it's not too strict and that it's a bit vague, so that employers do have flexibility in navigating within the law. And that's, this was done pretty much the entire time that we've been dealing with COVID. There's been a lot of gray area in certain things, and then there's been a lot of specifics in other things. Like when we think of the vaccine mandate now, there's a whole thing on the vaccine mandate, which we can come to on another episode. But there are certain states that said, hey, you can and you can't do this, and we'll leave it to you to decide what that means. But if you strictly violate X, it's not going to look good for you. So that, allowing for the gray area, I think is where that's the sweet spot for government influence on legislation that impacts businesses and business decisions. The other mixed feeling that I have toward this is that employees who have grown with a company internally are often making less than what companies recruiting externally are paying someone coming in from the world, for example, from the street. And that is really because of various things. So one, if someone has not gotten a raise, whether because of COVID or because they didn't earn it from a merit perspective, like performance perspective, so their pay was almost kept back. Two, if someone was on parental leave and they missed the increase period, that could also have an impact on, their rate of pay increasing over time. If someone goes on a leave of absence of any kind, their pay is stunted, right? Also, if someone, started 5 years ago and was promoted, but their promotion percentages were not high enough to keep up with market trends and inflation and things like that, then their pay could be less than someone coming in externally, even if it's unintentional. And so you could have someone with 5 years of experience in the company making $20 an hour versus someone coming in as a candidate with the same 5 years of experience earning $30 an hour. And so I think this is where companies should really be mindful to make sure that in this moment when they're doing salary reviews, because that is the time that companies, if you're in the Q1 of the fiscal year now as an organization, because some organizations are different, you are looking at salaries and compensation reviews now. So if you're listening to this, take this into consideration, because if you have employees who are below what you would ever bring someone in externally at, again, let's say the range is 15 to 20. If you have someone earning less than 15 in a place where your range would never be below 15, you have to get that person up to the threshold ahead of this pay transparency law taking place, because otherwise it's going to create huge issues, not only for your employees, but for the organization. And I think about those moments that are unintentional and definitely can happen with a lack of change management. Again, coming back to missing pay raises being on pause, especially in 2020. We saw a lot of that, someone being out of the business, whatever the situation is, that person could end up unintentionally being lower than the minimum. And I imagine that companies will take this into consideration and give market bumps or cost of living bumps, or if someone's earned it from a merit perspective, maybe they just increase them all at one time. But if you're not thinking that way and you're in a state that is impacted by these pay transparency laws, then you have to start thinking about this now. So all in all, I do have mixed feelings, but in general, I do think it's important to have transparency. I'm a transparent person, and I think if done right between the company and the law, then I think everything will work out just fine. Okay, let's get into a little Q&A. So I got a few questions from you all throughout these last few weeks. The first was actually from someone who asked if they could recommend a guest. This was through the anonymous submission form that I have in my link tree. And someone said, hey, can I recommend a guest that you bring on the show? Absolutely. Thank you for doing that. I will be reaching out to this person to connect. And, if you have people that you really admire or want to hear from, or, maybe even have worked for in the past and think could make an interesting guest, send them my way. I love to bring interesting and new ideas to the podcast, but especially by way of thought leaders and, people that I can, broaden my network with. So definitely keep submitting those guests. And yes, if you haven't seen my anonymous submission form, check it out again in my link tree, which is always in the show notes. Second question of the episode. Someone reached out to me on Instagram and said that they have a question about breaking into HR. This person doesn't want a recruiting job, but when they graduate, they want to have a better understanding of what titles to look for. And currently, this person is working as an assistant to a business owner and is basically the business owner's second in command. And this person who reached out essentially helps with everything from finding employees, managing them, inventory, planning for future, students because of the nature of this business. And this listener, I should say, who reached out, runs the social media account as well, and just overall helps to support running the business smoothly. This listener goes on to ask, would you recommend I negotiate a job title? It feels like a great opportunity. Upon being hired, I was told 2 different salaries, and the business owner said that they needed to speak with the accountant to figure out which salary to go with. But then when they got their first paycheck, they found out the salary was lower than both of those salaries. So I'm going to pause here because these are 2 separate issues, right? First is breaking into HR, which I'll get into. And then the second is, how to navigate this pay negotiation, salary increase, etc. So first thing, breaking into HR. If you don't want a recruiting job, I think it's really important to look for roles that are specific to being more entry level or, like that, beginner stage of your career level of experience. And you can do that actually on LinkedIn. You can look for experience level requirements. But aside from that, in terms of specific job title, I would recommend HR generalist, HR assistant, HR administrator, HR intern, if you're able to have that time potentially where you're earning maybe even less of a rate, because typically interns, at least in some states, are paid minimum wage. Other states, they have to go through, and in most states, I should say, because there are federal requirements around this as well, interns that are unpaid have to go through check off very specific boxes to be unpaid. So most internships these days are paid. Anyway, I digress. Those are the job titles I would recommend looking at. Generalist titles can sometimes be senior, so just be careful and be very mindful to read the job description thoroughly so you're clear on what the role requires. Now, the second part of this submission, which I had to say I haven't responded yet, and I'm going to once I finish recording this podcast episode, because I've been thinking about this person. I think that's awful. To be really candid, I think that's awful that, this person was told 2 different salaries and then isn't even making the lower of the 2. So I just feel like, considering this listener is doing, what sounds like is going above and beyond, I don't think it's so nice. Even if you weren't going above and beyond, if you were just doing the minimum of your job, I don't think it's right that you didn't have pay transparency. Perfect episode to talk about this, right? Like, you should know exactly what you're earning before you start earning it. So I would actually say, even if you're working for a small business or a business owner that, is maybe running everything themselves, get some sort of contract or offer letter, get something in writing, even if it's over email, to be clear on what you're going to earn so that you are protecting yourself and your interests as well as theirs. That is not something I would ever recommend a business owner to do, to just, not have some sort of contractual agreement, even though most states in the US are at-will states. And I've talked about this before, there is still a reason to have an offer letter, even if you only have 1 employee. So I would say to this listener, and I will say this to them as well, mention that, you are interested in title X. It sounds like you're doing generalist roles. So I would say negotiate an HR generalist title with HR generalist pay. So if you're earning an hourly rate, then figure out what hourly rate you really want to be at and, what your minimum is. I would never suggest going into a negotiation with, a lack of clarity on what your minimum is. Like, know exactly what that rate is so that if they go below it, you can say this, I'm not willing to go below X. Be really clear, because the less decisive you are and the less confident you are in what you're offering, the more likely they are to push back and maybe challenge the negotiation. So figure out what your minimum is, figure out the title that you want. Again, I would recommend HR generalist based on what you're doing, or HR assistant. I could see both being good options here. And then talk to the business owner about the rate of pay and why you deserve it. I think the best part of a negotiation, or the best way to go into a negotiation, is to have all of your ducks in a row and all of your facts. Be really clear on the things that you've worked on, how you've impacted them, ways in which you've grown the business, if quantifiable, and even the ways that you've grown the business qualifiably. So if you've improved employee experience, if you've improved the culture, if you've, focused on birthdays and anniversaries, things that are felt versus, quantified by number, those things are just as important. So go in with all of those things clear in your mind. And I would guess that you would come out of that meeting pretty successful. I hope, at least. And if not, then you should probably look for somewhere else to work, because from the beginning, it doesn't sound like this business owner really had your best interest in mind, so to speak. And of course, I don't want to assume that that's the case, but, let's say those two salaries were higher than the owner's, accountant felt comfortable, allowing from a financial perspective. At the very least, the person should have gone to you and said, hey, I know we discussed a pay between X and Y, but actually it's going to have to be Z. And I understand if that's upsetting. I really, I didn't think it was going to come to this, but I hope that this is something that you'll be happy with. Like, that is the appropriate thing to do if pay doesn't land where you had discussed it would land. So that is my advice to you on both of those things. I'm sure that there are listeners who are not the person who asked this question who are going to benefit from this conversation. So if you are someone that has a question that you want to hear my take on, or, throw at me, please reach out to me. You can email me at podcast@hrtracy.com, or you can DM me on Instagram at hrtracy. Wherever you feel comfortable reaching out, I am all ears. Thank you so much for being here again for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe, and I will see you next week.